So here's an interesting question. It kind of crosses both of you. It's from Gavin Lowe. He says, robotics plays a strong part in production, right? But each operation is on a unique individual. So is this something that a robotic surgeon can't replace entirely?
The surgeons would like to be in the loop. It's unlikely that we can automate the process the same as it's done in a factory. But we want to change the role of a surgeon from someone who is manipulating the tools to someone who is making decisions. There are huge variation in anatomical structure and size. AI provides us the ability to adjust the plan or the surgical plan to variations in these anatomies. So to answer the question, with AI, we can overcome a variation in the scene and still perform the expected surgery.
Okay. Now, do we have a microphone in the room, right? Do we have someone running around with a microphone? Yes? Is there any question from the floor? I have a question I'm going to ask Dr. Kara. But there's a question down there, so if you could bring the mic down there. All right, and this is actually a question for both of you, because you point to the need for regulation. And I would think with respect to a surgical robot, does that need then either TGA or FDA certification? What are our processes? Do we have mature processes, say, outside of medicine for these kinds of certifications?
So FDA is the agency, Federal Drug Administration in the US, that regulate everything related to health. To pass a system like that through FDA approval, that's a $100 million proposition. That is a hurdle for many startups, and that's why there's such a few numbers of surgical robotic system.
Because you can't be a lean startup with a $100 million gate.
Right.
Right.
The thing that the FDA is mostly afraid of is the software component, because the hardware is very tangible. Yeah. They can understand it. It's very hard to predict how the software will behave in many circumstances.
I think the manufacturing is, in a medical robotics, obviously, you're dealing with within your national boundaries. So it's much easier to introduce actually regulation within your own country to control things. But in manufacturing, it's actually you are crossing the boundaries. So the question, unless we come up with an international understanding of how this communication is going to take place, it's going to be pretty challenging. So that's what's required, really, when I say regulation, into international regulations that I'm
well,
talking
and you
about.
pointed to the need for standards, and it's interesting because I was just talking to some folks who are working with GS1, who does all the barcodes, but they're now going into this so they can study international flows of manufactured materials. And so do we actually see this coming? Is there sort of a bottom-up movement from all of these different sort of stakeholders in this?
I think it's actually bottom-up and top-down. I have a position in Germany as well, and this is, I forgot to mention, but Industry 4.0 coined actually in Germany. They are driving it understandably because of the strong manufacturing industry and the IT industry together. And there is a push, obviously. They know it's coming and they want to influence the decision-making when it comes to how the regulation is going to be formed. But I think it's also, it's coming from different domains. And when you look at things, Internet of Things and Internet of Services and big data, that's also coming from a different direction. I think the events like these actually are quite valuable to bring these people together so that the people at least have the common understanding. At the moment, it's not there. I mean, perhaps what I'm talking about is not even realistic.
Question.
If a manufacturing facility can be located anywhere and be run by a very small set of staff, why can't we then eliminate the distribution, like intercontinental shipping, et cetera?
There are alternative movements, actually, a concept that we've been working on, for instance, urban factories. It's quite interesting, and again, it's going back to the Industrial Revolution. During that time, the craftsmen actually worked downstairs, lived upstairs. So with the most personalized demand coming from the market, the only way to deliver that if you are close to customer. So the question is, instead of building these large-scale factories outside the cities, which takes 3 hours to get there and come back, there's nothing sustainable about that. The question, can I bring those factories in a much smaller scale? Now we have cleaner production technologies, quieter. So you work actually downstairs and live upstairs. There is also that movement as well. I mean, it's a fair statement what you are asking, because does anyone know how many kilometers behind a toothbrush? Yeah, it's close to actually 40 to 50,000 kilometers by the time it reaches you. I mean, it's crazy that the things that we do for the sake of economies of scale. So there is also a push to decentralize the actually production. Instead of building one large factory in entire Australia, how about if I build actually much smaller factories in every city, and with a much smaller footprint, and cater for the customer around me. And that brings actually a competitive edge for the developed countries, because they've been actually soul searching with the changes in manufacturing. If I'm going to cater for the needs of the population around me, then an overseas company cannot compete with me. So that's actually entirely mass personalized. I think there's another movement perhaps we can talk about actually outside. That's an interesting direction.
But this touches on, I think, the message from the media is the robot's going to put us all out of work, right? Surgeons, everyone else, blah blah blah. No, but this is the message we're hearing. I try very hard in my own work to sort of dispel that. What you're pointing toward is a world where, in fact, it's much more bespoke, and so people are spending their time designing, perhaps not fabricating, because the fabrication work is now part of these new value flows.
That's correct.
And would you say that, one of the interesting things that I had a penny drop moment while you were giving your talk, and I realized that if you get a good surgical robot, then the number of instances where people can have access to surgery increases radically.
There is I just want to make comments with respect to the previous topic, which is standardization. So in medicine, there are no standards. I mean, there are standards of care.
Practices.
There are good practices standards. But if a surgeon was trained in one center, you compare that surgeon with another one who trained in a different center, they will perform the same procedure, but they will perform it differently. So you see a collision, it's almost a cultural collision between how we practice and how we try to embed technology into that practice, because once you automate the process, you need to standardize the process.
Right.
And there is not even an agreement within medicine itself how it should be done.
So does that mean that when a hospital gets a surgical robot, a team might have to completely retrain their procedure around the need of the robot?
Right now, it's simply a teleoperator. So there is nothing much once you introduce a robot to change the process. They will still perform the surgery, or the methodology of performing the surgery will be different from different places. The robot didn't inflict the change, but once you start automating, this would be the collision point between.
Question from the floor, anywhere? There's a couple back there. Okay.
My question kind of applies to both, really. Have you thought about using the maker base of 3D printing to do your distributed standard of communication, and to provide that way of pushing something out further or closer to the endpoint of distribution? You've got a bunch of standards there around 3D models that kind of meet manufacturing, and maybe could be adjusted to meet process and surgery.
So all of the standards that are emerging, the bottom-up standards that are emerging in sort of just-in-time and 3D manufacturing.
Let me see if I understood your question. Obviously, when we talk about standards, let's say you are producing a car, and the different elements actually needs to be built in multiple places, and then it comes together and you assemble it. And it entirely depends on what's the end product and what will be the consequence of actually if the product fails. So it's okay. I mean, if you are playing with small 3D printers actually, which are mainly toys to produce things with a very small consequences. But if we are talking about products with serious implications for the society, then we need to have a common understanding during that information transfer. If something goes wrong, then who should be the person actually answering this question? I think still we need of course, the bottom up is there. We are soul searching at the moment, but I think the international community actually needs to get together. If this is coming, maybe they need to actually think about how we can orchestrate that.
Okay, so here's a question that's come from the floor, but it rolls into a larger question, which we don't have. Do we have fully autonomous surgical robots yet, or are they just coming?
So in the old days, when AI emerged in the 60s, the AI community said, well, we'll solve all the problems that you'll ever have, and obviously this is over-promising and under-delivering. And that's why AI suffered for so many years where people were pushing it back. But now it's coming back because data is available. And when data is available, you can start automating things. It's likely that you will not, we are at least a few decades away from a situation where you'll get into the operating room and the surgeon will press a button and everything will be done autonomously. What we, as scientists, being more realistic now, working on automating subtasks of the surgery.
Right.
So, for example, if you want to suture, the surgeon will point to the beginning and the end of the suture, and then the surgical robot will do it autonomously.
Okay, so the question sort of springs from this, which is as we get more and more autonomous elements in the surgery, what happens when the surgeon and the autonomous element have a difference of opinion?
This is an interesting active research, especially in collaboration. So you've seen the 4 arms. We're working on a project where 2 of them are controlled by an AI, and the other 2 are by a human.
I saw
so
that.
So they both share the same space.
Yeah.
So the question is, what are the privileges that you give to each one? Even when 2 surgeons are operating, there is always the sort of the master and the assistant. So the master will always make decision, and we prefer it to be that way.
Right. Okay, so there's already a protocol, a framework for that in the operating theater.
Right.
Okay. All right, so we have time for one more question for the floor. We had another question someone wanted to ask. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Kara, sort of, we can see Amazon, Alibaba, and Apple are actually the first companies that are really starting to, just because of their volume and the way the material flows work through those organizations, are starting to approach these kinds of CPS systems that you're talking about. Do you want to sort of talk about how that might actually start to evolve in the world?
It's a typical integration, example of how they are vertically integrating with manufacturers. I mean, these companies, they have no background in manufacturing, but by using the cyber-physical system and they're controlling the demand and the supply side, they are utilizing actually someone else's facility in certain parts of the world, and they are still producing products and meeting the demand. Then the question really becomes, where is the key competence? Or in the future, is it going to be the actually know-how of how to make things, or is it going to be the actually designing and creating actually to fulfill the needs of the society? Especially, I've got a project with a company here, for instance, for dental industries, that dentists actually design their own implants. Right? We developed a software tool. We took the expertise out of actually CAD. You don't need a CAD package anymore. So they actually design their own product and press the button, and the design comes to the company 3D prints it and send it back tomorrow. If you are moving actually towards that direction and the lines gets blurry actually, what is the competence? Is the competence then actually have solid your vertical integration between your partners actually to reach the customer? I think we are moving to that direction, and that's what the Alibaba and the Google perhaps actually a good example of that.
And then of course the implant gets implanted by a robotic dental surgeon.
I'm actually working on a project like that.
All right, let's thank Dr. Kara and Dr. Rosen.
Thank you.